Kate Milefalcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Helen. I am here tonight. It's nighttime. It's dark. It's Halloweeny. I'm here to tell you a very scary story. Now, this story is based on a book based on a true occurrence, sort of. I read the book when I was in my early 20s. I was working at a hospital at night, and evening. I'd get home after 11. And hospital work tends to be high stress, and it takes a while to unwind when you get off duty. So I would read a book. I lived with my younger sister. We had an apartment, and it was very quiet. So I sat down this night, and I had this new book, The Amityville Horror. I was so scared by that book that I was afraid to get up and walk across the room to the bathroom the whole entire night. I was so scared. So you'll be happy to know this is not the book. What I did was I watched a documentary called My Amityville Horror. It's on Prime. I think it's on YouTube too. It was made in 2012. And what it is a revisiting of the story with some, but not all, of the people who were involved, and centered around the son, who was 10 at the time of this haunting event, and now was a fully grown adult. And it revisits media people and therapists and other people peripherally involved, and it was a very interesting documentary. I think satisfying for people who are true believers that this was demon invasion, as well as people who are skeptics, people who are coming from a science point of view, psychological point of view. It's a really interesting documentary. So I'm going to summarize it for you, and then in a separate video, Deborah, Lupien, and I are going to see what she can find out. And I'm a little worried. I saged this place really well. So, okay, let's start. My Amityville Horror. And it starts out with a voice-over introduction. And the voice says, stories about this, like some of the stories involved, have never been told. My prayer is that everyone in this room never goes through such a thing. The hardest thing was the loss of being able to communicate with anyone else, to find someone to intelligently help. Now, this is the son who's talking. And he could not find really true friends. They would abandon him when they knew the story. Nobody understood. And this kind of thing does happen, he said. When you go through this, you become alien to everyone else. And he said that one of my therapists asked in less than one sentence for me to describe or label these experiences. And the first thing that I came up with is an unfortunate gift in my life. And that's Daniel Lutz, who was 10 years old when his family moved into this house in Amityville. And I will get to the story of what is so weird about this house. He went to a priest for help as a kid, and the priest said to him, "Boy, what's wrong with you?" And he said that I knew at that point in my life that I had no control over any of this. So he very briefly alludes to some of the things that he and his siblings' family experienced. He was thrown up a staircase, and we do get to revisit the house and see all these places. It's really interesting. Thrown up like his bodily thrown up a staircase. His bed levitated and was bouncing and hitting the ceiling, and even the posts of the bed stuck in the ceiling. There was a stench that would just manifest without any kind of reason in just random areas. the toilets would start bubbling black stuff like the clampets. You know, um, they would go into a room and it would be full of thousands of flies. And he's very reluctant to talk about it. He said, "This is not something that I enjoy discussing." He says, "Once I start talking about it, I become stuck with it. What he says is it's bringing it back to the front of his mind." Now, he's a very interesting man. And I can just tell you what my impressions were. I think he was very handsome, but he also had a very, he had a face that had shown a life of real trouble and struggle. His head was completely shaved. He was very bulked up, very muscly, and kind of rough around the edges. But he was a musician, played the guitar, but he played this really loud, electronic, loud guitar, very aggressive. He said when he was littler, before they moved into this house, his mother would say, "Good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people." And he said that this house taught him that sometimes bad things happen to good people too. So it starts out, the story, that was kind of the introduction. It starts out with a news guy, like a TV reporter, saying the house is peaceful now since the Lutz family moved more than 20 years ago. So it's an anniversary and they're revisiting the house. He said, "This house is not haunted, and it never was. This was a money-making fraud." And the documentary jumps from people to people, time period to time period, sometimes to show the contrast between what it was then and what it is now, what people were like then and what they're like now, and sometimes to continue a narrative without anybody having to say anything. They just do bits of interviews with various people. So this announcer, with his microphone in front of the house, being all TV guy, anchorman, he says, "It was a money-making fraud." Jump to Lorraine Warren, demonologist, and she says this is not a hoax. The reason it's calm, it's been exorcised. They brought in exorcists. Then we meet Dr. Susan Bartell. She was problematic. Dr. Susan Bartell, you could tell that mostly she worked with people with run-of-the-mill problems, and she had a big grin on her face, and she was doing her psych talk, and she gets this guy, Daniel Lutz, who is just oozing hostility and oozing, "I don't want to be talking to you." A very interesting dynamic going on. And Daniel's sitting across from her, and he says, "I don't introduce myself as that guy from Amityville." He said, "I used to be somebody completely different. Before it happened, I was a regular kid." He's very aggressive. His whole demeanor, his delivery, he's just looking for a fight. And what he wants to get from talking to her is he hopes to benefit his kids. He's concerned, they're concerned that he'll never really get past it. And he's ready now to try to deal with it. And he says it's not something I like to be associated with. He's been avoiding this for a very long time. He says, "I've been running away from it for my entire life, but it's finally caught up to me." He left home so he wouldn't be the Amityville kid, but we find out later that there was more to it than just that. So let's go back and talk about who he is. We'll get to the house. Don't worry. We'll get to the house and what weird thing happened there before his family ever moved in. But he was born in 1965 on Long Island, Daniel Edward Quarantino. His parents were high school sweethearts. There's lots of pictures, of them. He says, I'm a prom backseat incident. His parents were married very young because they got pregnant at the prom. and they were very family oriented. But they got divorced when he was 7.5, and he wondered if it had to do, if he blamed himself. And he was much closer to his mother. And when his father left, he had all these new responsibilities. He's only 7.5. So after a while, she dated, and she was still very young. She was about 17, I think, when he was born. So she's only 24. George is the guy that she started to date that became his stepfather. He said George was introduced into this. He was an ex-Marine. He was recently divorced, but he owned a house, and he had a carry permit. He was into guns. He had choppers, motorcycles. He had a family business. He had a boat. He had Corvettes. He was well-to-do, leaving us with the impression that to his mother, this guy, George, represented financial security. So then something happened when his mother committed to George. Something happened that, left a scar on this kid. Arrangements were made with his father, his biological father, that George, the stepfather, could adopt all 3 kids and would change their last name to his last name. So he now became Daniel Edward Lutz. And he said, George, he put his label on whatever was ultimately his. So we get the sense of this possessive, controlling stepfather. And a very angry little boy. He said, I started destroying his world every opportunity I got. I'd do anything in the hopes that we could go back home. So now we meet hero of this documentary, Laura Didio, investigative reporter. I really liked her. She asked the right questions. She wasn't afraid of a forthright question. She says, this family, not the Brady Bunch. There was a lot of tension because of the stepfather. Now she's talking about what she remembers as a young woman. She was probably in her 20s as a young reporter. I believe for Channel 5. I think it was the television. They never made that really super clear, but I inferred from more things that happened throughout the documentary. She met them all. Now she met them after the events that created the book, The Amityville Horror. And she said, there was a lot of tension because of the stepfather. Danny was more taciturn, always watching, always aware, hanging back, watching. She said she was putting on a radio show, and maybe she started out in radio. It wasn't terribly clear to me. She was putting on a radio show about psychic phenomenon, and the Lutz story and the Amityville Horror story broke. And so she tracked them down, and she told them that she had good contacts in parapsychology. That was her hook into their world. They didn't want to talk to media, but they wanted help, and she offered that. So she had a 5-hour conversation, and they gave her channel an exclusive. So what is the background of this house? It's very tragic. It's very sad, and it makes you wonder, that's for sure. So it's this gigantic house on I think a lake, and there's a dock and a boathouse and a lot of garden, big yard, and it's like 2 or 3 stories, 3 stories, I think, kind of federal colonial wood house, beautiful. November 13th, 1974, there was a mass murder in this house. 23-year-old Ronald DeFeo Jr. shot his father, his mother, his 2 brothers, and his 2 sisters with a .35 caliber rifle. All 6 were found, each in their own beds, face down, obviously shot while sleeping. There was no sign of a struggle. There was no sign that the first 2 or 3 people that were shot, the gunshot was heard and the others got out of bed. They weren't aroused by the noise. So They did toxicology, thinking, well, he must have slipped them something at dinner. They weren't drugged. He didn't use a silencer. So the question that has never been answered, that's gone on for 40 years, is how did he do it? How did he do it all by himself? And nobody heard anything, and nobody in the house heard the other victims being shot. Which opens the question, was he under the influence of the house? I have to say it because this influence is aggressive and malignant. Let's talk about that. George, when they were moving in, was fine, according to his stepson. He said it was a lovely house, and everything was just fine until about a week after they moved in. And then the mother, Kathy, felt her hand being touched. And he said it was like Lord of the Flies in the house. He said that he himself as a child went up to one of the rooms when they were moving in, and it was fine. And he came back with another box, and the room was full of thousands of flies. So he called his mother, and she freaked out, and he started killing the flies, and he was hitting them with a newspaper, and remember those, and killing tons of them, and dead flies everywhere. And he left the room, and when he came back, there was no sign that there had ever been a fly in there. Now, his mother didn't do it. She was freaked out and had him kill them. His stepfather was otherwise preoccupied, and the other kids had nothing to do with it. So he said the price of the house had been reduced dramatically, and they paid $80,000 for it, which in those days, that's not a small price, but it was an expensive house worth a whole lot more than that. But he said over a very short period of time, there became a mounting number of paranormal phenomena. He said there were cold spots in this house, and they would go around and block all the windows and all the doors and stuff the cracks under the door, and they'd have fireplaces going and furnaces going, and they'd have these awful cold spots. And he said on the second floor playroom, he looked out the window and saw two red eyes looking at him, and it looked very much like a pig. There were loud noises at night, and Danny said things were slamming around. For example, he was opening a window, and it was tough to get this window open. And he pushed it up, and he put his hands down, and somebody said something to him. He turned, and it just came down in full force, and he couldn't get the window back open. It was very weird. His hands were flattened. He was hysterical. And they got ready to leave, and his hands were fine. As soon as they kind of knew what was going on and realized he'd been injured and were getting ready to take him in to be seen by a doctor or something, his hands were fine. They went from being really bad, and he showed his broken finger. He had a broken finger. They never took him to the doctor, and I thought that was really weird that they didn't do that. And I think that the investigative journalist also felt that it was very odd. But she returned to the house with Danny, and she asked him, how much do you remember of what happened? Do you really think it happened, or do you think these are just stories that were made up? She said, I knew you as a child, because she'd met him, when she was investigating him the first time. It's been 20 years. She says, I knew you as a child, but I don't know the man. And he said, well, this house has defined him, and it's defined his siblings. And she asked, how did it impact you? Have you come to terms with it? Was this stuff real? She says, so tell me it's been 30 years. Tell me what you've been up to for the last 30 years. So he's talking to her, and she says in a voiceover that it struck her that these people, they were not really seeking publicity at first. They seemed pretty normal. They seemed just really freaked out. This is when she was called in and offered to connect them with parapsychological help. She said they weren't really doing that yet. And so she hooked them up with the Warrens, who are Ed and Lorraine Warren, famous demonologists. And they told the family, don't go into that house alone. Better to get a team of parapsychologists in there and rid the house of whatever the problem is. But they told the people that began to help them, we want you to respect our privacy. We don't want our kids involved in this. We want to keep the kids out of it. And then Danny says to her, well, yeah, that may be what they said when we were children, when you first met them. I wish I could have said something then. I wasn't able to speak. He said, I'd spit it all out. I'd tell everything that had happened exactly. And she's a really good reporter. She says, well, so how fresh is it now? You know, how well do you remember it now is what she's asking. And he says, it's all there. He says, I wish I could get rid of it. So she says, well, for example, what do you mean? She goes, well, I was outside one evening and they had the dog on a leash in a fenced area, which seems really cruel, but you know, near the boathouse, and the dog, garage, and the dog started to go ballistic. He said the dog jumped over the fence and was actually hanging by his collar and leash. And Danny ran over and saved the dog. And he says it really haunted his dream. If he hadn't been there, what would have happened to the dog? But the dog was afraid of the garage and afraid of the boathouse and would periodically lose his mind. His mother actually told children about the murders in the house when they went to look at it, like they bought it, but they just went to show it to the kids and said, is this going to bother you? Kind of late to ask. And at first he thought, oh man, this house is great. You know, there's a boat and there's a tire swing and there's a lake right there, or whatever it was, the body of water. And I get my own room and it's wonderful. So they're moving in, and mid-morning they're hauling these boxes, and he's all excited. Oh, there's a pool. He's all excited that there's a pool and a dock and a spiral staircase. But then he said it was really odd because a friend of the family showed up who was a priest, and he came to bless the house. So Daddy's outside getting a box out of the garage, and he said he just had this developing sense of unease in less than the first 2 hours of being there. He said the priest came, went in the house, and then Danny was thinking, oh, I could show him my room. He's a family friend. I could show him my room. This is so exciting. And he said the priest suddenly came out of the house and just left. Didn't say hello, nothing. Danny didn't even get to talk to him. He left so quickly. And Danny was upset because he wanted to give him a little bit of a tour. This guy's name is Father Ray. And he says to his mother, why did Father Ray leave so fast? And she said, I don't know. And he didn't really believe what his mother was saying. So he carried this box up to the playroom. And even though it was December, the playroom was full of flies. And, you know, his mother screamed. And in 10 minutes, he says, he smashed at least 100 flies. He went to get his mother to come see, and it was all gone, all clear. So he was very confused. And his unease grew because his mother was preoccupied and keeping things from him, and he could tell that she wasn't being forthright. His observation, and the observation of this reporter, was that different people reacted differently to this house. His mother entered this sort of state of lassitude and peace, and like the house kind of lured her in, and she never wanted to leave. She never wanted to go outside the house. But George was always cold and aggressive and angry, and it got much worse than when they lived elsewhere. And it just intensified and was more frequent. And then there were subtle personality changes in every single person who came into the house. People were more aggressive. People had shorter tempers. People were tense and on edge. And without talking too much about it, he said that violence became commonplace. Things like wooden spoons were used, you know, discipline. Danny said George, he really hates George. He still really hates George. There's so much anger, unaddressed anger in this man. It's really sad. He said George had no parenting skills. He was a Marine, and that's how he treated us. And the journalist says, well, what about your mother? Didn't she protect you? And he said, no, his mother did nothing to try to protect them. They had to call him Mr. Lutz or Sir. She says that it's really obvious that Danny was repulsed at a molecular level. And his response was, well, he's dead and I'm happy he's dead. I'm a free man and I had nothing to do with it. And she, you know, he's implying that he would have done something to George if things had continued. And she asks him point blank, is that what you mean? And he says he tried to 50 times. Be done with him. So next scene in this documentary, he's talking with the psychiatrist. And for a living, he drives a UPS truck. He's done it for a really long time, really likes his job. And he says he has several different names in the world. People know him by different names. People recognize him, but they recognize him from different movies in which he has had different names, and it's very confusing. He says, all I do is walk around protecting that 10-year-old kid. She says, you've worked so hard just to be yourself. This is the psychiatrist, big grin on her face all the time. And George had introduced himself as the Amityville guy. He became proud of it after this whole thing came to a head. And as Danny says, the attitude on George was, this is all about me. He was the biggest effing a-hole is how he calls him. You could have ever met. I mean, he really did not like him. And she asks him, were you physically threatened living in the house? And Danny says, well, he says, you know, I kind of got my kicks out of it in a sadistic way. That disturbed, it's not the word he uses, but the disturbed side of my brain. He says, I could not possibly top the chaos that was going on in that house. I had nothing to do with it. I didn't need to be a problem anymore because the house was. He said there would be a 20-degree difference in temperature in the center of the room. They'd have the fire on, the furnace going, all the drafts blocked up, and it would just be freezing. The whole family watched the garage door one day slam up and down with the dog freaking out, and the garage door is just going up and down on its own. All of them saw it. In his upstairs window of his sister's room, he saw this cartoon-looking angry pig with wolf teeth and red eyes. And he ran up to his sister's room, and they saw this from outside. And when they ran upstairs to look, there was nothing in the room, but the little rocking chair was just rocking all by itself. It never stopped. It just kept rocking and rocking. And they would look out the window and see the eyes watching them. He said, a force beyond my control is what it was. He said, evil can manifest at will. And I was the victim. And I know I was possessed. She asks him, do you think you were possessed? And he says, I know I was. He said he once felt a spirit pass right through him. It made his mother break down. One day he was running up the stairs, and he actually was physically picked up and thrown up the stairs. And these are spiral, complicated stairs. He said he could feel something went past his mother and into him and through him. He felt numbness, and he heard a voice say, it is you. And it stuck with him for a decade daily. His mother told him, well, no, it's okay. This means you're going to be okay. And so the journalist, she goes there, Didio, she says, so who was possessed? And he says, very emotional. He had a very hard time answering. He said, George and me. And he said, it was so far beyond my control. I no longer had any control of my body or my mind. she said men had violent reactions to this house and women seemed to be charmed and overcome by lassitude. He agreed with that. The boathouse had all this poltergeist activity, and sometimes it would just, the cement floor would just ooze this green slime. On January 6th, they took, oh, that's interesting. They took down all their Christmas decorations. And when they did it, he said, all hell broke loose in the house. There emanated this foul stench. All the windows kept opening and shutting and crashing down. It took 4 people to get the window up that was just going up and down. His mother had, this is when he hurt his finger, and his mother put ice on it and wrapped it in cloth with ice. And when they looked, the squished fingers were completely normal, like no bruising, nothing, just overnight. But he had 1 broken bone. And they said they all saw the spirit, whatever it was, cross the room. And he said it knocked a jar of peanut butter off a far table, like a peanut butter knife off a far table. And they saw it, like this disembodied thing, go across the room, knock the knife down, sit in this banquette bench around a dining table, and then just disappear. So the hand that was bruised and swollen and awful, it took 1 second and it was back to normal, except for that pinky finger that was broken. Now we talk to Marvin Scott. And in '76, he was the reporter on the documentary, What Really Happened with the Psychics and the Demonologists and all that. They did this follow-up, documentary at the channel, and he spent the night in the house with all of these researchers and psychics and stuff. He said he saw nothing. And he's a stone cold skeptic, and he was like completely dismissive. He saw nothing. He said the psychics made excuses for why they didn't see anything. He said, the psychics said, well, the spirits have been cleansed and they've been scared off. And they did today in modern times. They brought all these reporters back together, and they all sat around a table in a circle and discussed going through this experience. And they had a very interesting conversation. They said the Lutzes were convinced, and we really wanted to believe them because they were so sincere in their belief. Except for one cameraman, they felt nothing. And this cameraman, who was, I guess, what did he say he had done? I think he'd been in a war zone. He was just hard-bitten guy. He goes into this house, not a care in the world. He started having palpitations and having like a kind of a surreal feeling. So then they talked to Lorraine and Lorraine Warren, not Ed, because Ed has died by modern times. Lorraine says this was a demonic force from deep in the bowels of the earth. And she took pictures that night, and she did actually get a very strange picture of what very much looks like a child peering to the side of the stairs looking at them. So there's a counter argument to what went on, as opposed to possession or ghosts or demons or whatever. The counter argument is these people had to leave the house because they had no money and it was going to be foreclosed. George's business was not doing well. He had, I think, a surveying business, and it was not doing well. But they were only in the house for 28 days. So how do you go into foreclosure in 28 days? I don't know. It's pretty odd. George was raised a Methodist, but was not a practicing Methodist. But there were a lot of rumors about him being into the occult. And the journalists, and these journalists are all skeptics, They're not of the Lorraine and Ed Warren belief system. And so they're talking about, we think George opened up some sort of triggered something that was possibly begun by DeFeo. That's kind of a popular theory. DeFeo was under the influence of the house when he killed his family because it didn't feel like there was any reason for him to do it. And how did he do it? How do you shoot 6 people with kind of a rifle-y shotgun kind of thing, a long gun? And nobody wakes up, nobody hears it. Nobody's even stirs from their sleep. But George was fooling around, they think, with something dark and evil that he didn't understand and maybe made it worse. After the Lutzes moved out and the journalist came in with the psychic said, you know, there has been a lot of ritual magic done in this house. There's no way to prove that, but this is what the psychic said. Black magic. And he said what he thinks may have happened is it stirred up enough negative energy that the psychological and hallucinatory experiences that people had, they thought that they were real. They thought they saw a pig. They thought they saw flies. They thought that doors and windows and everything were happening. But they were paranormally induced by the negative energy from this black magic. And there are allegations that George really did know more about the occult and the supernatural than he admitted. Danny described George's books. He says he couldn't believe it when George brought all these books into the house. They were all metaphysical, parapsychological, paranormal, mind control. He was really into mind control and hypnosis. Interesting. Danny's cousin gets interviewed. He's great. He says that George, he was not right. He says it was really sad. Now, he's roughly the same age as Danny. He said you could see the fear on the kids' faces when they were around him. Everybody was different around this guy. There was fear and anxiety around his presence. And he remembers thinking to himself, something is off. Something's not good here. So Didio talks more about this, and she says, you know, whatever happened after DeFeo murdered his family, the theory is it lingered, and George gave it renewed energy. He triggered it. Ed Warren, and this is back in the day when it first happened, said that certain people antagonized the house. The Warrens met George at the house, and he wouldn't go on the property. He met them on the boundary of the property, wouldn't go on. Didio took Danny back to see Lorraine at her house. Now, Ed had died. Danny had met her when he was 10. He met both of them. And Lorraine, she's all in on this. She is all in. So, did I write this down? Okay, so you go into her house and it's just decorated with stuffed tchotchkes and knickknacks, and it's just everywhere. And in the middle of the kitchen are 2 cages with 2 gigantic white chickens in them. And she's talking to these chickens like they're, you know, listen, I have chickens. I wouldn't keep them in my kitchen. That's all I can say. So Ed Warren, okay, he said that people agonized the house, and Didio took Danny back to see Lorraine. And Lorraine said in that house there was a true personification of evil, and very possibly George triggered it. She said you have to pad yourself to take George on. She's implying that George, like the cousin said, there's just an energy about him that was palpable, negative and palpable. And it wasn't that the cousin knew anything about George. He just said you could feel it when you met him. A lot of people said this. Lorraine said the minute I met George, he's just off-putting. She said you had to walk on tiptoes around him. Anything could offend him. Danny said he wasn't a father. Danny left home at the age of 13 and a half. He ran away. And he had run away a number of times before that. But this time he said to his mother, I have to get out of here or somebody is going to get hurt. And he begged her, just let me go. And he went off by himself into the desert when he was 13 and a half. Lorraine said that the clergy told Ed, please don't go into that house again. It's going to kill you. There's this weird scene. She's they're at Lorraine's house and she's wanting to talk about all this stuff. And she suddenly stops and she looks around at everybody in the house and she looks at the film crew and she says, does everybody here have faith? And there's this kind of hemming and hawing, and two of the film crew guys say they admit kind of reluctantly, they don't want to talk about it. They admit that they're agnostic. And Lorraine's ready to shut it all down because these guys don't believe in the Bible. And Didio speaks Lorraine's language, and she says to her, Lorraine, remember that Jesus and the doubting Thomas, Jesus was willing to be around people and lead by example. And Lorraine went, oh, yeah, but I'm afraid this is not very respectful. And she pulls this thing out and she says, I have in my hand a piece of the true cross right here. How disrespectful would it be for me to take it out in the presence of non-believers? So there's this tense moment, and Didio kind of talks her down off the ceiling. And she says, when I first came through that house, I didn't have this. But what I did have in my hand, and they show video, and you can tell she's holding something, but you can't see what it is. She said, I had hair from the head of Padre Pio. And Padre Pio appeared to her in the house to protect her. Now, poor Danny is eating this up with a knife and fork. He goes, oh, man, this is amazing stuff. In modern times, as an adult, in her kitchen, she's talking about this. For those who don't know, Padre Pio was I think he was a monk. I don't think he was a priest. Could be wrong there. And he started having the signs, the stigmata, the signs of the cross, the nails in his hands and feet, and the lance that they poked Jesus with in his side when he was on. He started having those, and there are miracles associated with him. I actually went to, I guess it was a monastery or a church that he was associated with in Italy. It's part of this order of brothers, priests, who I've mentioned this before. You can pay to go in and you walk down a hall, and the hall is on one side, and to your right are these three-sided rooms. You're looking at the open side that has no wall, and the whole thing is a scenario like a diorama, and it's all made of the bones of the monks who live there. Crazy stuff. Anyway, she's got his hair in her hand, and that's going to protect her. Danny thinks this is just amazing stuff, and Lorraine says, you have faith, you can kiss it. And she lets him kiss this cross, this relic that's the true cross. Danny says a small part of him did whatever he could because when he was angry in the house, his small part of him kept doing bad things, because when he was angry and he kept the anger in the house up, more stuff went on in the house, and he looked forward to getting into trouble. He liked it because it tortured George. The more traumatic and dysfunctional it got, the better, and the worse it got, the better I liked it, he said. Yeah, the more tension in the house, the more the phenomenon grew. The energy in the house was feeding into the aggression and the tension. And Didio said, maybe you imagined all this. You know, she's not afraid to challenge him. And Danny said, yeah, maybe it was in the Kool-Aid too. He's not hearing it. He is 100% convinced that this all really did happen. He says, I've stopped trying to persuade people about this. If you don't believe me, you don't believe me. She asks, were you just an angry kid who was really ticked off? Did you ever doubt yourself that this really happened? And he said, no, it was too clear and too real. So she says, Did you ever have a sense? This was a question that was in my mind because his energy is just so angry and aggressive. She says, do you have any sense that whatever was in that house would follow you off the property? It takes him forever to answer. He's like on the verge of tears. He's trying to tear it out of himself. And he finally says, yes. And she says, when did that start to happen? And he said, when I was wandering the neighborhood instead of going to school. And he is so troubled. Oh my God, this young man is so troubled. He says to Didio, the journalist, my mom and the younger kids were naive about what George was into. He was already fully into it, before we ever moved into the house. He wanted to be able to control somebody else's mind or an object, and he mastered both. So the story continues to get weirder. He said that he believes that what George believed and practiced was a catalyst for the energy in the house. He said it was like a magic trick gone bad, and you couldn't shut it off. He was into telepathy and he was into telekinesis, and he had all these books about it, and he was always practicing it. Danny claims that before they ever moved into the Amityville Horror House, George could move things with his mind. And Danny swears that he saw it himself. He says, I was not supposed to know. I stumbled on it one day. I got out of school unexpectedly. My mom didn't know. I was in the backyard. I heard voices in the garage. And he went and peeked. They didn't know that he was home. And George had friends that he was impressing. And he got something to move telepathically. And Danny went back in the house and told his mother. And George's friends just got up and left. She confronted George, and the friends just all were gone. Danny had a doctor's appointment that night, and he told the doctor everything. And the doctor, he's telling this story to the doctor. The doctor didn't even look up. He was writing notes, and he never even reacted. Then he took Danny's mother aside privately and talked to her. And Didio, the journalist, says, well, the doctor should have told your mother that your son needs to go for tests. This is an incredible tale. Just no nonsense. And Danny says, there's a doctor out there somewhere who's heard the story and knows. He's got it in his notes and he knows. Well, yes, he heard the story, but does that make the story true? That's the question that he just completely won't listen to an argument. So Didio interviews Elizabeth Loftus, who's a professor of psychology at UC Irvine. And she says, okay, in answer to that, the doctor has the notes, therefore it must be real. She says people can exaggerate for a lot of reasons. And sometimes it's not conscious exaggeration. She said, we remember things in bits and pieces. We don't remember a continuous, uninterrupted narrative. Our memory it has gaps in it. And we fill it in. And once we fill it in, then it feels like that really did happen, the way that we filled it in. We may be motivated to remember more dramatic or more interesting version of what really happened. So that was interesting. Then the documentary goes back to the roundtable of Channel 5 media guys, the journalists, and they had a very interesting conversation. It wasn't all denial or dismissal or ridicule. They actually had a substantive conversation. And one of them says, well, where does imagination start? Where does reality end and imagination start? He says, inflicting all of this and the notoriety on a child, he said, that was what was demonic. Danny says to the psychologist, I don't like to expose my psychological scars. And the Dr. Loftus, points out the huge influence on a 10-year-old that a parent would have who believes this stuff. Exposing him to these ideas, he's soaked in suggestion. Children are suggestible. So she says, did he get a memory of flies that were really flies there? Or was all of this a post-suggestion from the film? Or did the parents talk about it? You know, at this point, is it even possible to parse that? How would you know? And Danny says the last day in the house, that was the day that he and his brother were in their bedroom and the beds were levitated, which instigated them leaving permanently. Their beds smashed into each other and then up to the ceiling. And they lifted up and slammed down and lifted up and slammed down. So then there's a recording of George talking about this whole scenario. I think it might have been on a talk show or an interview. And he's very persuasive. He's not overly excitable. He doesn't seem obviously deceptive. It seems like he really believes this. And he says, I looked over at my wife, Kathy, and she had the face of an old crone. They tried to call the priest and the phone wouldn't work because they were calling the priest, is the implication. So they abandoned everything they owned and they fled in their van. And he still is very bitter, this kid, now a young man, Danny Lutz. Well, not that young anymore. He's very upset still. He says, we left everything that I owned. Still very resentful, very angry. He said, I was in my pajamas and I left my possessions. They let the bank foreclose on the house. Then they became subjects of intense scrutiny. Neither of them was working, so that was a problem. They had to move to the other side of the country to escape the notoriety. Danny talks about the humiliation in grade school when people found out who he was. They would see his parents. They did a whole media tour and were on television shows, and kids at school would see them, or they'd see one of the movies and it would start up again. The cousin said that they were chased all over the country, that the kids could not go to school. They were so harassed. The family could only teach them, the family, like the extended family, could only track the Lutzes, George and Kathy, through media coverage. They never knew where they were. They tried to hide. Danny said, I became hyper aggressive. My parents got a large advance to do a promotional tour, I guess for the book, maybe for the movie. I don't remember. He said he got put in a Roman Catholic monastery school. This poor kid. He said the priests started doing exorcisms on him all the time. Because I was possessed by a spirit I could not get rid of on my own, he says. He really believes this. He ran away a couple of times, and he says the priests beat the out of me. He said he didn't even talk to his mother for more than a year because she was gone. He refused to talk to her. She was just on this trip with George, had control over her. And I'm astounded that they didn't call. He said, I did not talk to her for over a year. He said, this was a family nightmare come true. It's like being awake in your own dream. He said, I used to live a structured life. And the pictures of when his young parents had him and were first married, they just looked all buttoned up and happy and clean. And it was a very predictable life. He described their daily routine, and it just all went out the window. So all of a sudden, we were moving constantly. I had no friends. I was living with a guy who, and a mother that was no longer the mother that I used to know. So he ran away at 13. Between 12 and 15, he ran away 8 times for a total of 2 years being gone. When he was 15, that was it. He didn't come back, and he was homeless. So Didio, the journalist, asks him, what was the worst part? And he said that I didn't get to tell my story for the first time. And she said, what was the silver lining? And he said, strength beyond strength. She asked him if the hauntings stopped. And he said, yes, when I was finally in Arizona by myself, he said, the only thing I fear now are just things that are beyond my control, not things that are man-made. So there's an element of evil or demonic or spiritual, whatever, and it exists. That the hardest thing for me to continue to deal with is that I know that this is true. So now we're back to the journalists again, and Didio's with them. And I think she says, I'm not entirely sure who says this, my feeling is the Lutzes may have experienced low-level paranormal phenomenon, and some of it was hallucinogenic. Something had a psychological effect on the family, something. And the Lutzes totally believed it. The reporter, Scott, I never saw anything. Didio says, I do believe there are forces that are beyond our comprehension from the normal five senses. I think there were other forces at work. It's very hard for a boy just 10 years old to distinguish between fact, fantasy, reality, whatever. George's personality, it fed off of him. It's interesting. All the professionals believe this. So why is Danny blaming George? It says, and she said, well, because he blames George for taking his mother away, loss of control in his life that he knew. Danny said, I just wanted somebody to believe me. The camera guy, at that point, now that he's an adult, he's sitting with the camera guy, and the guy behind the camera says, would you take a polygraph? He just went insane. He got so angry. He says, I'm going to have words with you after this is done. It was scary. He said, don't be pulling like that on me. Would I take it? Finally, he said, would I take it? Yes. Do I feel I need it? So angry. And then this finally ends with the information written down that since the Lutzes moved out, 5 different families, one by one, have lived in the house happily without incident. And that's the story of the Amityville Horror. Just surround yourself with golden light, burn a little sage, and always have the intent that you're protected and you want to only engage with highest vibration, the best intentions. And have a happy Halloween. Slán go fóill. Slánte.